The update appeared without ceremony. No trumpet, no palace statement, no polite announcement wrapped in tradition and velvet. Just a quiet change, a missing pair of names, and a digital silence so loud it rattled the world. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. People didn't notice at first. Most never do. Changes to royal pages come and go, titles shift, wording updates, commas play musical chairs. It means nothing until suddenly it means everything. Because on that morning, two names that had always been there, two names the world expected to remain untouched, were gone. Not moved, not rearranged, erased. And the most chilling part? No one explained why. Ask yourself something. What happens when a royal decision is made without context, without warning, and without a single official word to soften the impact? Does the silence calm the public or ignite them? That was the moment everything began. The moment quiet became chaos. The moment a routine update turned into the most whispered question in the modern monarchy. Why were the children removed? At first, confusion spread in tiny ripples, screenshots here, comments there, subtle gasps buried beneath scrolling thumbs. People blinked, refreshed their screens, convinced it had to be a glitch. The idea that the change was intentional felt too extreme, too impossible, too loaded to accept. But glitches don't stay consistent. Glitches don't match across devices and countries. Glitches don't spark this kind of stillness. One user posted a photo. Another confirmed it. A third whispered, "This can't be right." And suddenly, the ripple turned into a wave. Families at breakfast paused mid-bite. Students scrolling between classes stopped cold. Journalists who had been half awake snapped upright in their swivel chairs, staring at their screens as if the words themselves might rearrange back into comforting normalcy. But nothing returned. Nothing reverted. Nothing was undone. Because this wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Or at least, that's what the world began to believe. And belief spreads faster than fact, especially when the palace says nothing at all. Here's the part that made people uneasy. In royal history, silence is not neutral. Silence is strategy. Silence is signal. Silence is sometimes louder than any spoken decree. So when the palace made no comment, not a denial, not a clarification, not even a politely confusing sentence crafted by an overworked press secretary, people reached the only conclusion silence allows. Something had changed behind the scenes. Something big. Now imagine being in Meghan's position in this fictional scenario. Waking up to headlines that didn't exist yet, to conversations you didn't start, to decisions you had no control over. Imagine watching the world react before you even understood what they were reacting to. How would you respond? Would you panic? Would you stay silent? Would you demand answers? Or would you be too shocked to speak at all? Because in this story, Meghan doesn't start the fire. She walks into it. But before we reach her reaction, before voices rise and tempers snap, we have to go back to the part everyone overlooks, the timing. Because timing is never accidental. Not in royal life. Not in institutional decision-making. Not when legacy is involved. The change didn't happen during a quiet news week. It didn't appear in a slow season when the world was distracted. It surfaced at a moment already loaded with tension. A moment when the monarchy was under pressure, the public was demanding transparency, and internal decisions were stacking up like dominoes waiting for the slightest push. So here's the real question. Was the removal a response? Or a warning? Most people assumed the former. They believed it was reactive, triggered by something Meghan did, said, or planned. But what if the truth in this fictional scenario is the exact opposite? What if the change was already set in motion long before anyone noticed? What if this was the final step in a decision made months earlier? And what if Meghan wasn't the cause, but the consequence? Already, the story stops feeling like a glitch and starts feeling like a strategy. But strategy requires intention, and intention always leaves a trail. That's where the uneasiness began, not just in what disappeared, but in what remained untouched. If this were truly a routine administrative update, why was it so selective? Why remove only two names? Why now? Why this week? Why without explanation? People don't fear change. They fear unexplained change. And unexplained change is where theories grow, not because people want drama, but because humans fill silence with possibility. When there is a gap, the mind builds a bridge. When there is no narrative, the world creates one. But here's the twist. In this story, the public wasn't the only group trying to understand what happened. Inside the palace, behind doors that have seen centuries of secrets, there was movement. Not shouting, not chaos, but something far more unsettling. Urgency. Quiet urgency. The kind that doesn't make noise because it can't. Because the moment sound escapes, control is lost. Staff who normally joked in corridors spoke in lowered voices. Meetings that typically included 10 people suddenly included 4. Schedules shifted. Phones were carried more tightly. Every step felt calculated, cautious, observed. Something was happening. Something bigger than a webpage update. But no one, not the press, not the public, not even the people closest to the situation, knew what triggered it. Not yet. And that is where the tension truly begins. Because every story has a moment, a single heartbeat, when everything still looks normal from the outside, but the inside has already changed forever. This was that moment. The world just didn't know it yet. But the palace did. And Meghan was about to find out. Not through a formal message. Not through a respectful phone call. Not through a conversation handled with grace and preparation. In this fictional narrative, she discovers it the way everyone else does. Through silence. Silence that feels like a decision. Silence that feels like a statement. Silence that feels like the first crack in something that was already fragile. What comes next is not rage. Not yet. Because before anger comes understanding. And before understanding comes shock. But shock never lasts long. Especially when the world keeps asking questions you don't know how to answer. And those questions were just beginning. Because if the removal was intentional, if it was timed, if it was coordinated, then the next logical thought becomes the most chilling one of all. What else is about to change? The first headlines didn't explode. They whispered. A single line at the bottom of a news site. A curious tweet without context. A quiet question tucked in a comment section. Has anyone else noticed the change? No emojis. No drama. Just uncertainty. But uncertainty is gasoline. And the internet is a match. Within hours, the whisper turned into a hum. A low, vibrating confusion spreading across time zones. People compared screenshots, circled missing lines in red, tagged journalists, and waited for someone, anyone, to explain what they were seeing. But no explanation came. Not from the palace. Not from advisors. Not from the usual sources close to the family, who appear like clockwork whenever the world gets too curious. This time, silence stretched longer than usual. And that's when people stopped asking questions and started drawing conclusions. Because silence feels safe only when everything makes sense. But nothing made sense now. Parents began imagining what it would feel like if their own children vanished from an official record without notice. Teachers wondered how a decision could be made without communication. Even people who had never followed royal news felt a tug of uneasiness they couldn't quite name. The world didn't need context to feel the impact. It only needed absence. Absence is powerful. Absence changes the air. Absence forces people to ask, what are we not being told? And the longer the pause continued, the more the world believed the pause was intentional. Meanwhile, inside this fictional palace setting, the reaction was completely different. There was no shock, no confusion, no frantic scrambling to undo a mistake. Instead, there was something far more unsettling. Preparation. Because the people behind the decision already knew the world would notice. They just didn't know how fast. One official in this fictional scenario reportedly stood in a hallway, hands clasped tightly behind their back, staring at a closed door as if waiting for it to open on its own. Another shuffled through documents like someone searching for a line they hoped had vanished. Every step felt rehearsed, the kind of rehearsed that only happens when the ending has been planned long before the beginning. Inside the palace, the question wasn't, what happened? It was, how long until everyone else finds out? And that difference changed everything. Because when one side is shocked, and the other is prepared, you don't have a misunderstanding. You have a divide. On the outside, people stared at their screens, waiting. On the inside, people stared at each other, bracing. But the most crucial reaction hadn't happened yet. Meghan still didn't know. Not officially. Not privately. Not through any channel that would soften the blow. In this fictional narrative, she discovers it the same way millions of strangers do. Through a whisper that wasn't meant for her. A message forwarded too quickly. A comment she wasn't prepared to read. A silence that felt colder than any statement. Imagine that moment. Imagine the stillness. Imagine realizing the world received information about your family before you did. How would you breathe? How would you make sense of something that arrived without warning, without reason, without explanation? Shock doesn't come with sound. It comes with numbness. And numbness doesn't last. Because numbness eventually needs somewhere to go. But before it becomes reaction, before emotion turns into voice, something else happens. Memory. The mind begins to look backward, to replay every moment that suddenly feels important. Every awkward pause. Every strange delay. Every meeting that ended too quickly. Every email that arrived without its usual warmth. That's when understanding starts to form, not from what's said, but from what is remembered. But understanding does not equal clarity. Not yet. Clarity requires answers. And in this story, answers are the one thing no one is willing to give. Not the palace. Not the advisors. Not the people who made the decision. Not the ones who disagreed with it. And especially not the ones who knew this day was coming. Because here's the part no one outside the palace realizes. Every royal decision looks sudden from the outside. None of them are sudden on the inside. There are discussions. There are drafts. There are revisions. There are hesitations. But eventually, there is a moment when hesitation ends. And action begins. That moment is never visible to the world. But once the world sees the result, it assumes the decision happened instantly. It never does. So the real question becomes, when did this decision actually begin? Was it last week? Last month? Last year? Or even earlier? Because the change didn't arrive like a shockwave. It arrived like the final click in a long, silent chain reaction. But the world didn't know that, yet. Which brings us to the most dangerous part of any story. The space between discovery and explanation. That space is where speculation grows. Where theories multiply. Where emotions replace facts. Not because people want chaos, but because humans cannot live comfortably in unanswered questions. So they build their own. In this fictional world, some believed the change was symbolic. Others thought it was administrative. A few whispered it was personal. But no one, not one single person, predicted what the next 48 hours would bring. Because the update itself wasn't the real explosion. It was only the spark. The explosion was still coming. And when it arrived, it would not be quiet. It would not be contained. It would not be reversible. Because once the world starts asking questions, the palace never planned to answer. Control becomes a memory. And that is where the introduction must leave us, with one unavoidable truth in this story. The removal was only the beginning. It didn't start with a headline. It started with a notification, a tiny buzz, a glowing screen, a moment no one paid attention to. At first, it looked like nothing. A simple system update, a routine refresh. The kind of digital shift people scroll past without blinking. But sometimes the smallest changes are the most dangerous. Because within that ordinary update was the first clue that something extraordinary had happened. The list was different. No warning. No footnote. No explanation. Names that had always been there were suddenly gone. Not edited. Not relocated. Removed. And the strangest part wasn't the disappearance itself. It was the quiet. There was no announcement leading up to it. No soft language easing the public into the transition. No phrasing like temporarily adjusted or under review. Just absence. A clean, sterile absence that felt more deliberate than any written statement could have. Most people didn't notice for hours. Some didn't notice until the next morning. But the first person who did wasn't a journalist or a royal watcher. It was a teenager scrolling before school, barely awake, trying to pass time while waiting for the bus. They glanced, frowned, blinked twice, then refreshed the page like everyone always does when reality doesn't match expectation. But the screen didn't change. The missing names didn't come back. Their heart kicked once, fast and confused, but they didn't trust themselves. Who would? It was too early in the morning to be certain of anything. Maybe the page didn't load right. Maybe the Wi-Fi was acting up. Maybe their eyes were playing tricks. So they took a screenshot. Not because they thought it meant anything, but because sometimes people save things they can't explain. A reflex with no logic behind it. That single screenshot became the fuse. They posted it online with 6 words that would ripple across the world. Is this supposed to be gone? No exclamation point. No dramatic flair. Just confusion. It sat unnoticed for 7 minutes. Then someone else replied. I checked mine. It's gone too. 3 more people confirmed it. 5 more after that. Within 30 minutes, the question had spread across multiple countries. Within an hour, it had reached journalists. Not all of them cared at first. Some rolled their eyes, assuming it was a temporary glitch. Others bookmarked it for later, planning to revisit only if the situation escalated. But the escalation had already begun. Because glitches don't grow. Glitches don't synchronize across devices. Glitches don't match across platforms. And glitches don't stay unchanged the entire day. By lunchtime, dozens of people had confirmed the same thing. The list wasn't broken. It had been updated. And something was missing. That's when the world's breathing changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but collectively. A quiet tightening. A subtle shift. The kind of tension that fills the air before a storm. People didn't know what the removal meant yet, but they knew what it didn't mean. It didn't mean nothing. Because royal records don't change without reason. At least, not in this story. Someone always approves the update. Someone always signs off. Someone always knows. Which leads to the question that stopped everyone cold. If the update was intentional, then why wasn't it announced? Silence is common in the royal world, but silence after a change is different from silence before one. Silence before is privacy. Silence after is strategy. And strategy always means something is at stake. Across social media, tone shifted. Curiosity became concern. Concern became suspicion. Suspicion became theory. Not because people enjoy speculation, but because their minds needed a reason big enough to match the size of the silence. In this fictional storyline, some believed the palace was preparing for a larger restructure. Others whispered that the timing was linked to internal disagreements. A few wondered whether tradition was being rewritten without warning. But even the wildest theories couldn't explain one haunting detail. Why remove the names quietly? If the update was harmless, why hide it? If it was administrative, why not clarify? If it was temporary, why not reassure? The absence of answers became the answer. And nothing spreads faster than a question the world believes someone is avoiding. Journalists who initially ignored the story suddenly leaned forward in their chairs. Editors who had dismissed early messages now asked for confirmation. Newsrooms that had been planning slow-day coverage shifted their focus entirely. A missing name became breaking news. Not because of what vanished, but because of what didn't follow. No palace spokesperson. No clarification. No correction. Just silence. And silence is fuel. By late afternoon, the world wasn't asking if the names were gone. It was asking why they were removed. The difference between those questions is enormous. One is observation. The other is accusation. Meanwhile, inside the fictional palace setting, life did not look chaotic. There was no shouting. No frantic scrambling. No crisis meetings held in emergency rooms. Instead, the silence inside mirrored the silence outside, but for a very different reason. Inside, the silence wasn't confusion. It was anticipation. People already knew the update had gone live. They knew the world would find it. They knew questions would come. The only unknown was how quickly it would unfold. A senior aide paused during their walk down a quiet corridor, listening for footsteps that never came. Papers sat neatly stacked on desks, waiting for hands that hesitated before touching them. Every breath felt controlled, timed, intentional. No one dared break the quiet. Not because they feared chaos, but because they feared exposure. There is a difference. Chaos is loud. Exposure is permanent. Someone in this fictional palace was already waiting for the next step. The moment when the removal stopped being a discovery and started being a story. They knew the shift was coming. They just didn't know that the world would reach it faster than expected. And outside the palace, something else was happening. People were getting angry. Not at the decision. They didn't understand the decision yet. They were angry at the silence. Parents wrote messages online asking how such a change could happen without explanation. Teachers discussed it in break rooms as if the removal were a riddle that needed solving. Even people who never followed royal updates felt uneasy. Because this wasn't about royalty anymore. It was about communication, or the lack of it. Humans can adapt to anything, even loss, as long as they understand why it happened. But when something disappears without explanation, the mind refuses to let it go. It circles, it loops, it fixates, until the lack of answers becomes the threat itself. By evening, The conversation had reached a point of no return. People weren't waiting for clarification. They were demanding it. But the palace said nothing, and that silence changed the tone of the entire world. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was alarm. Because when an institution built on tradition suddenly deviates from tradition without context, the public doesn't remain calm. They brace. They assume something bigger is coming, something they have not been told yet. And they're usually right. Inside the fictional palace halls, the quiet deepened. Some staff avoided eye contact. Others spoke in whispers. Doors that were normally open were now firmly shut, not because the decision was uncertain, but because the consequences were. The removal was only step one. Step two hadn't happened yet, but it was coming. And when it arrived, it wouldn't be quiet. It wouldn't be simple. It wouldn't be something the world could scroll past and forget. Because the update wasn't the story. It was the warning. And the real story hadn't even begun. Nightfall didn't calm anything. If anything, it made everything worse. Because daytime confusion feels manageable, the world is awake. Explanations feel possible, and logic still has a fighting chance. But nighttime changes everything. Darkness turns unanswered questions into threats. Silence becomes heavier. Screens glow brighter. Minds spiral faster. And that's exactly what happened. People who had brushed off the update earlier in the day suddenly found themselves thinking about it again. Someone refreshed the page before bed, expecting the names to return like a bad dream correcting itself. But the names were still gone. Someone else checked 3 different devices, a laptop, a phone, a tablet, as if technology might decide to tell a different truth depending on the screen. But the truth didn't change. The truth never changes just because people want it to. And that realization created a new emotion. Dread. Not loud, dramatic dread, but quiet, sinking dread. The kind that presses into the ribs and lingers, refusing to leave. Around the world, lights stayed on longer than usual. Conversations stretched later into the night. People who never cared about royal updates suddenly found themselves scrolling through old articles, trying to remember details they never thought would matter. What was the last public appearance? When was the last official photo? Were there signs? Was something hinted at that everyone missed? Human nature isn't drawn to chaos. It's drawn to closure. But closure was nowhere in sight. Meanwhile, journalists who had hesitated earlier in the day now sat upright at their desks, coffee cups growing cold. Their instincts told them something important had happened, not because of what was missing, but because of how the palace responded. Or rather, didn't respond. A lack of denial is not the same as confirmation, but in the world of public perception, it can feel dangerously close. Editors made calls. Producers sent messages. Newsrooms shifted tone. The coverage changed from, "Is this a glitch?" to, "Why has the palace not addressed this?" That single shift is the moment speculation becomes a story. Not fact, not proof, just momentum. And momentum is powerful, especially when no one steps in to stop it. Inside the fictional palace, the reaction was the opposite of what the world imagined. There was no panic, no scrambling to craft a press release. No late-night crisis team huddled over glowing screens. Instead, everything was controlled. Lights remained on in only a handful of rooms. Footsteps echoed through long hallways, steady and unhurried. Staff spoke softly, not because they were afraid, but because they already understood something the world did not. The silence was intentional. In this story, the removal wasn't a mistake or an oversight. It was step one of a sequence that had already been approved. A sequence that could not be reversed. And that's what made the quiet so unsettling, not just outside the palace, but inside it. Because when a decision is irreversible, reactions stop matching. What matters is timing. And timing was the one thing no one could control anymore. By morning, the story had reached its first tipping point. It was no longer contained to screenshots and whispers. It had entered the real world. A reporter asked a question at a press briefing. A radio host brought it up during the morning commute. A televised panel hesitated before discussing it, and that hesitation was enough to confirm one thing. The update wasn't staying online anymore. It had become a public conversation, and public conversations have consequences. Some people demanded answers calmly. Others reacted emotionally. A few convinced themselves there had to be a benign explanation. But everyone agreed on one thing. The silence was making everything worse. Because silence creates space, and space gets filled. Always. By midday, the pressure was undeniable. Reporters called palace representatives, politely at first, then urgently. Royal correspondents sent messages asking for clarification. Tabloids began drafting headlines, preparing for whichever explanation arrived first. But no explanation arrived. Not even a vague, carefully polished sentence designed to say nothing while sounding meaningful. Nothing. And that's when the world shifted again. From suspicion to assumption. If the palace wanted to correct the narrative, they would have done it already. If the update was harmless, there would be no reason to hide it. If the change meant nothing, someone would have said so. Silence didn't just become the story. It became the answer. Meanwhile, in this fictional palace setting, the tension tightened, not because the world had noticed, but because the next step was approaching. A meeting was scheduled. Not publicly, not officially, but quietly. The kind of meeting that doesn't appear on calendars and doesn't involve the usual advisors. Only a select few were notified. Doors would close. Phones would be left outside. Voices would be low. Every word chosen carefully. Not because the decision was uncertain, but because the fallout was. Someone in that palace already knew what the world was about to learn. Someone knew the removal wasn't isolated. Someone knew it wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning. Back outside, the conversation took on a life of its own. People who had never agreed on anything found themselves united in confusion. Social threads grew longer. Videos circulated. Theories multiplied not because people wanted drama, but because silence leaves no neutral ground. You either fill the void, or the void fills you. And while the world spiraled, something else happened, something no one expected. A second change was noticed. Smaller, subtle, almost invisible. But not invisible enough. Someone spotted it. Someone shared it. Someone realized the removal might not be the only update. And that possibility turned confusion into urgency. Because if there was one change, there could be more. If one update happened silently, others might already be waiting. The world stopped refreshing for answers. It began refreshing for impact. Inside the palace, the clock reached the moment everyone had been waiting for, not with panic, but with inevitability. The door to the private meeting room closed. Chairs shifted. Documents were placed on the table. Faces remained still. What was said in that room would determine what happened next. Not to the world, but to the institution. And the institution always comes first. Not individuals. Not emotions. Not reactions. The crown. Only the crown. The first update had already shaken the world. The second would change it. But no one outside that room knew what was coming. Not yet. The removal was never the end. It was the signal. And the next step would not be silent. It would be decisive. It would be irreversible. It would be public. The update didn't happen on an ordinary day. That was the first detail people overlooked. Most thought the removal itself was the shock, the missing names, the silence, the confusion. But the real alarm wasn't what happened. It was when it happened. Because in the royal world, timing is never random. Not in celebrations. Not in announcements. And definitely not in decisions. Nothing is left to coincidence. So when the update appeared, quietly and without warning, it wasn't just the absence that unsettled people. It was the moment chosen for that absence to appear. A moment already overloaded with tension. A moment when the world was distracted, but the palace was wide awake. A moment that made sense only if it wasn't a glitch, but a calculation. Ask yourself this. If someone wanted to make a change without drawing attention, when would they do it? When the world was watching, or when the world was looking somewhere else? Because in this fictional scenario, something else was happening at the exact same time. Something the public thought was unrelated. A royal event was nearing. A major appearance was being planned. Schedules were shifting. Security was tightening. The palace was preparing for something big. So why, out of all possible moments, would the update happen now? Why not the week before? Why not the week after? Why not at a time when the world was calm and quiet? Unless the timing wasn't meant to hide the change, but to test the reaction. Inside newsrooms, that's when the tone shifted. Journalists stopped treating the disappearance as a technical hiccup and started treating it like the first domino in a larger sequence. Producers asked new questions. What else is happening this week? Who benefits from this timing? When was the last internal royal update? Has anything been delayed or postponed? Patterns matter. especially when decisions don't line up. And in this story, nothing lined up. Public appearances had been rescheduled. An official photo release had been held back. A planned announcement had gone strangely quiet. Individually, those things meant nothing. Together, they formed a question no one wanted to say out loud. Was the removal part of a bigger shift? Meanwhile, inside the fictional palace, timing was everything. The update wasn't posted at random. It was scheduled, approved, reviewed, executed, not by a machine, by a person. Someone clicked a button knowing exactly what time it was, exactly what day it was, exactly what else was happening. And that knowledge changed everything. Because when timing is intentional, silence becomes strategy. That's why the palace wasn't caught off guard when the world noticed. They already knew the world would notice. The question wasn't whether people would react, but how fast the reaction would spread. And it spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, the missing names weren't just a discovery, they were a symbol of secrecy, a symbol of change, a symbol of something the palace wasn't ready to explain. But timing reveals more than intention. It reveals pressure. And pressure inside the palace is never accidental. Someone had pushed for this moment. Someone wanted the update live before the event unfolded. Someone believed waiting any longer was a risk. But what risk? No one outside knew. Not yet. Out in the world, theories multiplied. Not wild, not dramatic, but logical. Some wondered if the update was tied to legal protocols. Others suspected internal restructuring. A few believed it was connected to succession rules. But none of those explanations fit the timing. Because if the decision were purely administrative, it could have been made quietly months earlier. If it were ceremonial, it would have been announced with polished language and gentle phrasing. If it were symbolic, it would have aligned with a visible royal milestone. But the update aligned with nothing the public could see, which meant it aligned with something they couldn't see. That realization created a new kind of tension. The kind that comes not from shock, but from awareness. People stopped asking, "How did this happen?" and started asking, "What else is happening?" It was no longer about the update. It was about the timing. Even those who tried to dismiss the conversation couldn't shake the uneasiness. Why today? Why this hour? Why now? Because timing isn't just detail. Timing is motive. And motive is the one thing the palace didn't want anyone to consider. Inside the fictional palace halls, staff walked with the careful calm of people who knew something sensitive was unfolding. Not dramatic, not chaotic, but sensitive. Meetings lasted slightly longer than usual. Schedules shifted by minutes, not hours. People spoke in measured tones, choosing their words the way one chooses steps on ice. No one wanted to be the first to say the obvious. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was response. But response to what? Something had happened before the update. Something that forced the decision forward. And whatever it was, the palace believed waiting could cause damage. That's why the update didn't come with explanation. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much to say. Outside, the world sensed the shift without understanding it. People didn't need details. They could feel the tension. Humans always feel the truth before they hear it. But the truth hadn't surfaced yet. It was still inside the palace. Still behind closed doors. Still being managed, or delayed, or contained. And containment has a limit. There is always a moment when silence collapses under its own weight. This story was nearing that moment. But not yet. Because before the truth reaches the public, it reaches the people closest to it. And in this fictional scenario, there was one person who sensed it before anyone else. Not through a statement, not through evidence, but through instinct. Someone who had seen this pattern before. Someone who recognized the timing. Someone who understood what the palace does when it feels cornered. They weren't surprised by the update. They were surprised it took this long. And they were about to speak. Not to the public. Not to the press. To someone who desperately needed answers. The call didn't come through a phone. Not in this story. It came through proximity. The kind of communication that doesn't need words, only presence. A quiet knock on a door. A subtle pause before entering. A moment suspended between what is known and what can no longer be avoided. Because inside the fictional palace, someone had reached their limit. Not emotionally, strategically. They could feel the weight of the decision pressing inward, tightening the air. Timing had shifted from controlled to unstable. There is a point in every plan where silence is no longer protection, but exposure. And they had reached it. The conversation began without pleasantries. In the royal world, even fictional, politeness is not always kindness. Sometimes it's armor. Sometimes it's delay. But there was no time left for delay. The advisor spoke first, their voice low enough to be contained but firm enough to signal urgency. It's begun. No details. No explanation. Just acknowledgement. The room fell into stillness. Because once a decision reaches public awareness, everything changes, not the outcome, but the consequences. There is no pulling back, no undoing, only managing. The person seated across from them didn't respond immediately. They didn't need to. Their silence was not confusion, it was calculation. How fast? They finally asked. The advisor didn't hesitate. Faster than expected. That answer mattered. Not because speed changes truth, but because speed changes control. Outside the palace, the world continued to react. But now the tone was shifting again. People weren't just confused. They were connecting dots. And when the public starts connecting dots, even imaginary ones, narrative becomes impossible to contain. Threads appeared online comparing timelines. Recent royal absences, delayed announcements, canceled appearances, oddly phrased statements. Things no one cared about a week ago suddenly looked suspicious. Not because they were suspicious, but because timing made them suspicious. That's how perception works. Events don't change, meaning does. And meaning is determined by context. The removal had changed the context of everything that came before it. Even benign details now looked loaded. Even coincidences now looked deliberate. That is the power of timing. It rewrites the past without touching it. Inside newsrooms, a different shift occurred. Journalists stopped asking when the palace would respond. They started asking why the palace hadn't responded. Those are not the same questions. One assumes clarity is coming. The other assumes clarity is being withheld. Once the world believes information is being withheld, silence becomes guilt, even when silence is strategy. Meanwhile, inside the fictional palace's private meeting room, something critical happened. Not a dramatic reveal, not an emotional outburst, but a decision. A decision about timing. The discussion was not about whether the update should have happened. That part was finished. The discussion was about what would follow. Because removal without communication is step 1. Step 2 is response. Step 3 is consequence. And step 4 is fallout. But the most important moment in any crisis is the space before the first response. The space they were standing in now. They knew the world was waiting. They knew speculation was growing. They knew silence had a deadline. But they also knew something the public did not. Speaking too early is more dangerous than not speaking at all. Because once a statement is made, it cannot be undone, only amplified. So the question inside the room was not, what do we say? It was, when do we say it? And whether they would speak at all. Because sometimes the palace does not respond. Not because it has nothing to say, but because saying anything would confirm the importance of the moment. But while they debated timing behind polished doors, timing outside was collapsing. The public was no longer curious. They were impatient. And impatience turns quickly into assumption. Parents who felt uneasy the night before were now vocal. They weren't asking politely. They were demanding accountability. Not for themselves. For the children at the center of the removal. In this fictional world, people began saying things like, it doesn't matter what the reason is. Communication matters. Children shouldn't vanish from records without explanation. You can't expect silence to be enough. Even people who supported the monarchy felt unsettled. Because timing without transparency feels like betrayal. And betrayal, even imagined, is emotional. Emotion spreads faster than fact. Fact waits for confirmation. Emotion does not. By afternoon, the conversation crossed another threshold. It was no longer about the disappearance. It was about responsibility. Who made the decision? Who approved it? Who allowed it to happen this way? That shift terrified the palace more than the reaction itself. Because questions about process become questions about power. And questions about power threaten stability. In the fictional palace timeline, this was the moment one person realized something crucial. The removal didn't cause the crisis. The timing did. If the update had happened months earlier, quietly, slowly, with explanation, the world might not have reacted at all. If the update had been announced publicly, with context, with phrasing, with reassurance, the public might have moved on within a day. But silence plus timing equals explosion. Always. Outside, the first panel discussion aired on television. Not dramatic, not accusatory, but cautious. Caution is the final stage before escalation. Once television enters the conversation, it no longer belongs to the internet. It belongs to the world. Experts discussed protocol. Hosts asked carefully worded questions. Guests danced around assumptions. But the message beneath every sentence was unmistakable. Something was off. People don't need evidence to sense a shift. They only need timing. Inside the palace, the realization landed hard. The silence had reached its limit. They could no longer wait for the world to calm down. The world wasn't calming. It was accelerating, which meant only one option remained. Containment. But containment is not correction. Correction is explanation. Containment is delay. And delay only works when nothing new happens. But something new was already happening. Someone inside the palace, someone who had been quiet until now, decided they could no longer stay silent. They reached out privately, not to the press, not to the public, to someone directly connected to the situation, someone who deserved to know what was coming. The message was short, just one sentence. But that single sentence would change everything. You need to prepare. No details, no context, just warning. Because timing wasn't an accident. Timing was a signal. And the signal had only just begun. What came next would not be subtle. It would not be quiet. It would not be controlled. Because the removal wasn't the decision. It was the trigger. And the real decision was still on its way. The message didn't arrive through email. It didn't come through a phone call, a letter, or a formal briefing. It wasn't official. It wasn't documented. In this fictional story, it arrived the way the most dangerous information always does. Quietly, privately. From someone who shouldn't have spoken. Just one sentence. 6 words. Sent to the wrong person. Or maybe the right one. You need to prepare. It's starting. No explanation. No context. No follow-up. And that was exactly why it was terrifying. Because warnings are scary only when the person giving them refuses to say more. The recipient froze. Not because they understood the message, but because they didn't. There are 2 types of fear. Fear of what you know is coming. And fear of what you can't name yet. This was the second kind. The message spread privately, passed from one trusted hand to another, hushed and incomplete. No one dared ask questions directly. No one wanted to be the first to acknowledge what they suspected. Because acknowledgement makes fear real. And no one was ready for real. But leaks do not stay contained. They travel. Not loudly, not publicly, but inevitably. Someone repeats it to a friend. Someone overhears a whisper. Someone notices a change in behavior. And before anyone realizes what's happening, a private warning becomes an invisible storm. Meanwhile, inside the fictional palace, the atmosphere shifted in a way that can't be explained, but can always be felt. People didn't speak differently. They moved differently. Footsteps became quicker. Eye contact shortened. Doors closed sooner. Conversations stopped the moment someone entered the room. Silence wasn't absence anymore. Silence was tension. And tension always means the same thing. Something has already happened, or something is about to. Outside, the world still believed the missing names were the story. They weren't. They were the spark. The real story was the reaction happening behind the walls no one could see. Because this leak, the one sentence whispered to the wrong person, had confirmed something no palace statement ever would. The removal was not a glitch, not a misprint, not a delay. It was intentional. And intentional changes always have a reason. In newsrooms, that realization spread like a pulse. Reporters who were cautious before suddenly shifted tone. Not aggressive, not dramatic, just sharper. Questions changed from, is there an explanation? To, what is being hidden? And that difference is the moment a story stops being curiosity and becomes investigation. Producers requested deeper research. Archived footage was reviewed. Timelines were cross-checked. Not because new information appeared, but because silence created suspicion. In the fictional palace timeline, one advisor recognized what was happening. They knew the most dangerous part of any crisis is not the event itself, but the vacuum around it. Once the public believes information is being withheld, the truth no longer matters. Perception becomes reality, and perception was turning fast. Inside the palace, the person who sent the warning message felt the weight of what they'd done. They hadn't planned to speak. They hadn't meant to get involved. They were supposed to stay neutral, silent, invisible. But silence has a breaking point. They had seen enough behind closed doors, heard enough in restricted meetings, watched enough decisions made without hesitation. They didn't leak information to cause chaos. They leaked it because someone deserved to know before the world did. But leaks are like matches. No one intends to burn the house down. They just want light. And sometimes, light is the most dangerous thing you can spark. Outside, the leak spread indirectly. Nobody shared the original message, only the effect of it. People began saying things like, "Something bigger is going on. This isn't the whole story. There's more they're not saying." Not wild theories, just instinct. Humans are built to sense danger before they can explain it. But the fictional palace underestimated that instinct. They believed silence would slow the reaction. Instead, silence accelerated it. Because information doesn't need proof to spread. It only needs doubt. And doubt was everywhere now. Meanwhile, the person who received the original warning tried to get clarification. They sent a message back, carefully worded, cautious, non-accusatory. Starting? What do you mean? No reply. They waited. Minutes. Hours. Still nothing. And silence, when you're expecting an answer, becomes a message of its own. Not denial. Not reassurance. Just confirmation. Inside the palace, the advisor who sent the warning was already regretting it. Not because they feared punishment, but because they finally understood something chilling. The decision could no longer be contained. It was too late. The leak had shifted the balance. Because before the message, the crisis was internal. After the message, it became inevitable. What started as a silent update was turning into a chain reaction, and the next link had already begun to move. Someone else inside the palace, someone much closer to the decision, was preparing to speak. Not intentionally, not heroically, but because pressure always finds the weakest point. And the weakest point was about to break. The first real sign wasn't words. It was behavior. In the fictional palace setting, people who normally handled routine tasks with casual efficiency suddenly moved with guarded precision. Papers were no longer left on desks. Conversations that once happened in open hallways shifted behind closed doors. Even eye contact changed, shorter, sharper, cautious. Something had shifted internally. Not an announcement, but an atmosphere. Atmosphere always changes before truth does. One staff member entering the communications wing paused, sensing the difference before they saw it. Desks normally cluttered with notes and printouts were cleared. Screens that usually displayed schedules now showed login pages. The air felt heavy in a way no memo could explain. They approached a colleague, whispering instinctively. Did something happen? The response wasn't verbal. Just a look. A look that said, "Don't ask. Not here. Not now." Silence inside the palace wasn't strategy anymore. It was fear. Because once a leak exists, even one sentence, everyone becomes a suspect. Trust evaporates. People become careful with their words, then careful with their thoughts, then careful with their presence. The palace, fictional or not, does not handle uncertainty well. Control is its foundation. And now, control was slipping. But the public didn't know any of this. All they knew was that the silence surrounding the removal felt different now. Heavier, loaded, intentional. The disappearance of the names was no longer a mystery. It was a warning. Online discussions intensified. Posts that would normally disappear into the endless scroll began gaining traction. Not because they were dramatic, but because they were reasonable. People said things like, "If this was nothing, they would have said something by now." Or, "You don't stay silent unless there's something to hide." Logic had shifted. Silence no longer suggested calm. Silence suggested danger. And danger, real or imagined, changes behavior. Journalists began contacting people they normally wouldn't. Former staff, retired aides, anyone who might offer insight into how decisions like this were made. The calls were subtle, careful, framed as curiosity. But curiosity is rarely what it appears. Inside the palace, meetings multiplied. Not large ones, small ones. The kind held in rooms with no windows and thick carpet to absorb sound. The kind where voices don't rise because rising voices mean panic, and panic cannot exist here. One sentence kept repeating in those rooms. Who spoke? Not, what should we do? Not, how will we respond? Just, who spoke? Because in this fictional world, the palace didn't fear the leak because of what was said. They feared the leak because of what it implied. Someone inside was willing to break silence. Once one person breaks silence, another always follows, and the palace knew it. Meanwhile, the original recipient of the warning message could feel the shift happening, even without additional information. Instinct replaces certainty when answers are withheld. They reached out again. No accusations. No panic. Just 4 words. Is something happening soon? Still no reply. But silence is not neutrality. Silence is choice. Hours passed. Then, without warning, they received a second message, not from the same sender, but from someone else entirely. This one was longer. Still vague. Still careful. But different. It didn't confirm the decision. It confirmed the fear. You haven't heard the last of this. Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just inevitable. And inevitability is more frightening than chaos. Chaos is loud and visible. Inevitability is quiet and unstoppable. Outside, the public shifted again, this time from suspicion to certainty. It didn't matter whether anyone had proof. Emotion had already replaced evidence. People now spoke as though the truth was settled, even though nothing had been confirmed. Theories became statements. Questions became conclusions. Silence became guilt. And guilt, perceived or real, is impossible to reverse once accepted by the public. Inside the palace, the advisor who sent the first message realized something devastating. They had not prevented fallout. They had accelerated it. Because leaks do not slow crises. Leaks speed them up, not because of what they reveal, but because of what they imply. Control is weakening. Control is slipping. Control is gone. And once the outside world senses loss of control, they push harder, not to understand, but to expose. Pressure builds. Containment cracks. People break. The advisor tried to fix what they'd started. They attempted to reach the recipient again, this time to calm, to reassure, to undo. But undoing a leak is like trying to unring a bell. Once sound exists, it cannot be pulled back. They typed 3 messages in a row. Don't panic. It's being handled. Please don't say anything. But the recipient didn't respond. They weren't ignoring the messages. They were processing them. Fear reshapes the mind differently than logic does. Logic asks, what is happening? Fear asks, what does this mean for me? And fear spreads faster than any leak. By evening, the public narrative was no longer about missing names. It was about secrecy, transparency, accountability, children, and stories involving children, fictional or not, hit differently. People react emotionally before rationally, emotion before logic, feeling before fact. Every crisis expert in the palace knew the pattern, but knowing the pattern doesn't stop it. It only confirms it. The advisor who sparked the chain reaction wasn't the only one struggling with the weight of it. Someone else inside the palace had reached their breaking point, not out of fear, but out of conscience. They didn't want the world to panic. They didn't want chaos. They wanted truth. Because in this fictional narrative, they believed the silence was doing more harm than the truth ever could. So they made a decision. A dangerous one. They would not leak to the press. They would not speak publicly. They would not expose anything explosive. They would tell one person. One. Someone who needed to know. Someone already affected. Someone who would soon be forced into the center of a story they didn't ask to be part of. They picked up their phone. Not shaking. Just resolved. And they typed a message that would do more damage than any headline ever could, not because of what it revealed, but because of what it confirmed. We didn't expect it to happen this soon. No one saw it. No one intercepted it. No one stopped it. But that single message would be the moment everything changed. Because now the situation was no longer hypothetical. It was real. And real is irreversible. What came next would not be contained. It would not be whispered. It would not be quiet. Because the leak was no longer inside the palace. It was spreading outward. The message arrived when the house was quiet. Not early morning. Not late at night. One of those still, in-between hours when time feels suspended and reality hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. In this fictional narrative, Meghan wasn't expecting anything. She wasn't checking news updates, wasn't scrolling, wasn't preparing herself for impact. She was doing something ordinary. And ordinary is the most vulnerable state a person can be in, because shocks don't hurt most when they're dramatic. They hurt most when they interrupt normal. A phone buzzed once. Not urgently, just enough to break stillness. She glanced without interest at first, Another message, another notification, another harmless interruption. But her expression changed the moment she saw the sender. There are messages you open casually, and messages that make your body go still before your mind even understands why. She tapped the screen. One line. We didn't expect it to happen this soon. No context. No explanation. No punctuation at the end. Almost as if the sender had run out of time or nerve. Her heart didn't race. Not yet. Shock doesn't always rush in. Sometimes it walks. Slowly. Quietly. Like it wants to make sure you feel every step. She read the message again. Then again. Because when something doesn't make sense, the brain tries to force meaning by repetition. But repetition didn't help. If anything, it made the absence of information heavier. She typed one word back. What? Not dramatic. Not emotional. Just instinct. Minutes passed. No reply. Stillness turned into tightness. Tightness turned into heat. The kind that rises in the chest when the body senses something the mind can't explain yet. She checked the news. Not because she expected to find anything, but because silence had suddenly become threatening. Nothing. No alerts. No headlines. No public explosion, which only made the message more terrifying. Bad news is easier when the world knows it too. Private uncertainty is worse than public disaster. She tried calling the sender. It rang once. Then the call ended. Not declined. Just gone. That silence said more than words ever could. Something had happened. Or was about to. But she didn't know what. That's when instinct took over. In this fictional scenario, Meghan walked through the house as if the floor itself might shift beneath her. Not in panic. Panic comes later. But in surreal, suspended disbelief. She reached for her tablet. Opened the web page. Waited for it to load. At first, everything looked normal. Her breathing slowed. Maybe the message was unrelated. Maybe she had misunderstood. Maybe everything was fine. Then the screen refreshed. And her entire world changed. The names weren't there. Gone. Not hidden. Not moved. Gone. She stared without blinking, unable to process what her eyes were showing her. Sometimes the mind rejects information not because it isn't clear, but because it is too clear. She refreshed the page. Then again. Then again. As if repetition might undo reality. But the reality didn't change. The absence stayed. Her breath hitched. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But like her body forgot how breathing worked. Shock doesn't happen in one moment. It happens in stages. Recognition. Resistance. Collapse. She whispered a single word to herself. Not out loud. Not fully formed. Just a breath with shape. No. Not the angry no of rejection. The quiet no of disbelief. Outside, the world was already talking. Inside, she was just realizing the conversation was about her. And her children. Children who had not asked to be part of any decision. Children who were now missing from a list without explanation. There are moments in life when sound disappears. Not because the world is quiet, but because the mind retreats. This was that moment. She didn't cry. Not yet. Tears require understanding. Understanding hadn't arrived. Only shock. She tried to make sense of it logically. Maybe it was temporary. Maybe it was an error. Maybe the page was being updated. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. But every option collapsed under the same truth. If it were harmless, she would have been told. People are notified before small changes. People are prepared before sensitive adjustments. People are warned before the world finds out. But she hadn't been warned. The silence wasn't accidental. It was devastating. She sat down, not by choice, but because her body decided standing was no longer possible. Silence filled the room. Not peaceful silence. The kind that feels heavy and sharp, like the air itself is waiting for something. Her phone buzzed again. For a split second, hope surged. The kind of desperate hope that arrives only when someone is drowning emotionally and searching for a surface. She grabbed it instantly. But it wasn't clarification. It wasn't reassurance. It was worse. A forwarded screenshot. No message attached. No words needed. Screenshots don't explain. Screenshots confirm. Her pulse finally reacted. Not fast. Hard. A single, painful thud that echoed through her ribcage. She zoomed in. Stared. Wished the image would blur into something less terrifying. It didn't. Because screenshots don't lie. Screenshots don't soften impact. Screenshots don't give time to prepare. She set the phone down, but her hand didn't release it immediately. Fingers stayed tense. Muscles locked. The body holding on to the only piece of information it has, even when that information hurts. Shock was ending. Something else was coming. Not anger. Not yet. Anger requires direction. Before anger comes the most dangerous emotional state. Awareness. Awareness changes everything. It makes the situation real. It makes the silence offensive. It makes the timing unbearable. Outside, people continued reacting without understanding the internal fallout they had unintentionally triggered. Inside, Meghan's world was splitting into two. Before the screenshot. After the screenshot. She stood, slowly, movement returning not because she was calm, but because she was no longer frozen. Shock had passed, and the next stage had begun. She needed answers. Not speculation, not theory, not rumor. Answers. But the fictional palace wasn't giving her any. Not yet. And the longer the silence held, the more emotional pressure built. Because silence doesn't prevent explosion. It creates it. She didn't shout. Not at first. People imagine breaking points as loud, explosive moments, voices raised, objects thrown, emotions spilling everywhere like shattered glass. But real breaking points, even in fiction, don't start with noise. They start with stillness. A stillness so sharp it feels like the world is holding its breath. Meghan stood in that silence, phone in hand, trying to understand how something so small, a missing name on a screen, could change the way air moved in a room. She tried calling again. No answer. She tried messaging again. Still nothing. And that's when something shifted inside her. Not panic, not fury, but realization. The decision had already been made. Without her. Without warning. Without conversation. Understanding does not soften impact. Sometimes it makes it worse. She walked into another room, not because she knew what she wanted, but because the human mind seeks motion when reality feels unbearable. Standing still makes pain bigger. Moving makes it smaller, even if only by inches. She sat down at a table and opened the laptop, hands shaking now, not dramatically, just enough to reveal what her expression still hid. She pulled up the page again. The names were still gone. Seeing something a second time doesn't make it easier. It makes it undeniable. She whispered again, this time a different word, barely audible. Why? Not the angry, why demanding justification. The wounded, why searching for reason. But no reason came. She scrolled, searching for anything she might have missed. A note, a footnote, a line of text explaining the change. Something, anything, offering context. There was nothing. Absence stared back at her. Absence hurts differently than loss. Loss has finality. Absence has questions. And questions, when they involve children, don't just upset people, they fracture them. Her breathing quickened, shallow and uneven, not because she was overwhelmed, but because her body was trying to compensate for something her mind couldn't control. That's when the first tear formed. Not a dramatic sob, not a breakdown, just one tear. A physical acknowledgement that reality had crossed from confusion into pain. She wiped it quickly, almost angrily. Like the tear itself was betrayal. The shock had transformed. Not into calm. Into urgency. She needed answers. She needed clarity. She needed someone to explain how the world found out before she did. She picked up the phone again, this time calling someone different. Someone who never ignored her calls. Someone who always answered. It rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Then voicemail. Silence again. That silence was worse than the missing names. She stared at the device, disbelief turning into something sharper. Not rage. Not yet. But heat. Heat has stages. First it simmers. Then it rises. Then it boils. She tried another number. This one connected. The voice on the other end sounded careful. Too careful. Not surprised. Prepared. That was the first red flag. Preparedness means awareness. Awareness means the situation wasn't new. She spoke slowly, each word placed with precision. When were you told? There was a pause. A long, trembling pause where both people knew the answer mattered more than anything that came before it. Finally, the reply. I can't talk about that. Not, I don't know. Not, I'm not sure. I can't talk about that. 3 words that confirmed everything. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't mutual. It was planned. She felt her chest tighten, not with confusion anymore, but with betrayal. Betrayal doesn't explode. It spreads. Quietly. Like ink into water. She spoke again, this time more firmly. Why didn't anyone tell me? The voice on the other end hesitated, then offered the most dangerous answer possible. It wasn't my decision. That sentence is a knife. Because if it wasn't their decision, then someone else made it. Someone higher. Someone who chose silence over preparation. Someone who wasn't worried about impact. She ended the call. Not abruptly, just decisively. There was nothing left to say. The next emotion arrived slowly, like a door opening in the distance. Anger. Not wild. Not reckless. Cold. Cold anger is different from hot anger. Hot anger reacts. Cold anger decides. She stood again, posture changing. Not slumped. Not shaken, but controlled. Her voice returned. Not loud, but steady. And steadiness is sometimes more powerful than volume. In this fictional moment, she didn't scream. She didn't beg. She didn't collapse. She planned. Because once shock ends, strategy begins. She wiped her face, straightened, pulled her shoulders back. Something inside her shifted from wounded to ready. She reached for the phone again, not to ask questions this time, but to take action. She typed a message, not long, not emotional, just precise. We need to talk. Now. Sent. Delivered. Seen. But no response. That silence didn't weaken her. It solidified her. Because silence can crush a person, or it can create resolve. And resolve is the beginning of change. Outside, the world continued reacting, unaware that the story they were discussing was no longer a distant headline. It was becoming personal. Inside,